This is Suchitra Vijayan, and you're joining us for the Polis Project's Politics podcast. In 2015, in response to columnist and full-time inciter of hate, Katie Hopkins published a piece in the British tabloid Sun calling African immigrants cockroaches. Ms. Hopkins is not alone. Speaking at an election rally in 2018, Amit Shah, India's Minister of Home Affairs, called Bangladeshi migrants termites. Trump has done something very similar. Shah or Trump's spiteful rhetoric echoes authoritarian leaders and genociders and war criminals who not only orchestrate mass violence but also destroy nations through dangerous speech for petty political ends. Dangerous speech and ideologies that catalyze mass violence are strikingly similar across the world and through time. And there is now evidence that hate in media leads to real life violence. As researchers across the world have proved over and over again, hate in media leads to anti immigrant and anti minority hate crimes. In response, social media campaigns like Stop Funding Hate have been launched with the aim to stop companies from advertising in and providing funds for certain newspapers, media platforms that use fear and division to sell more papers. Joining us today to discuss online hate, how these campaigns work, and more importantly, what can we do to make funding hate unprofitable are Richard Wilson and Dr. Ritumbra Manuvie. Richard Wilson is a writer, human rights activist, and co founder of Stop Funding Hate. Launched in August 2016, the campaign seeks to make hate unprofitable and promote the idea of ethical advertising by persuading companies to pull advertising from media that incite hatred against minority groups. Dr. Ritumbra Manuvie is an assistant professor and the executive director of Foundation London Story, where her work revolves around hate speech and hate crime. She looks at how hateful narrative contributes towards dehumanizing minorities and vulnerable groups. Her campaigns and research was instrumental in getting Op India, a right-wing based tabloid comparable to Breitbart, defunded from Google's AdSense. Richard and Dr. Ritumbra, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to be part of this discussion.
Richard, I want to start with you first. Can you tell us how Stop Funding Hate started?
Yeah, so Stop Funding Hate began in 2016 in the UK. And the real sort of trigger for us in launching the campaign was a big spike in hate crimes that took place in the summer of 2016. And that was happening in the context of the referendum that happened in Britain that year, but it was also the culmination of a set of issues in our media that had been going on for years and years and years, because that year alone we saw over 100 front page stories in national UK newspapers relentlessly pushing very negative messages about migrants. And many people at the time had a strong sense that there was a clear connection between the hate that we were seeing in the media and then the hate crimes that were really surging on our streets. And a number of people I knew were concerned about this, and I could see that it was something that people were talking a lot about online. And so I spoke to a few friends about trying to do something about it. And the thing that really sort of played on my mind, and it may have been because I was working as a fundraiser myself at the time, was who's funding this? And I remember looking at a copy of one of these newspapers that had been particularly notorious, which was the Sun newspaper. And I noticed that my phone company was one of the advertisers in this newspaper where I'd seen so many of these hateful headlines. And so when I was starting to think, well, who's funding this? Well, actually, inadvertently, I was funding it because I was a customer of a company that was helping to pay for this newspaper through its advertising. And I found that when I started speaking to people I knew about it, there was a lot of interest. And then it turned into an online discussion in a Facebook group. And that Facebook group very quickly became very busy, and lots of people joined that group. And out of that sort of discussion in a Facebook group, we began this whole campaign that's still going on now.
Richard, thank you. Ritumbra, can you tell us how you're a scholar and a professor by training, and a lot of the work you do looks at hate speech and hate crime. Can you tell us about the work that now you've started doing, especially the success with deplatforming of
Yeah,
media?
sure, Suchitra. Yeah, sure. So we started looking at hate speech, particularly in context of Republic Television, after we got pointed towards Manisha's article in News Laundry on bloodlust. And we just decided that we need to perhaps do a Twitter campaign because it was not possible to go out and protest. We just entered the COVID, phase of 2020. And we decided to do a Twitter campaign. And that's when I actually got in touch with Richard on Stop Funding Hate. And I said that, hey, we are going to do this Twitter campaign. Can you help amplify our voices? Because we were a very small group. And Richard very kindly agreed to do that. And it did make a lot of impact, that campaign. And after that, we just followed up with Renault, and we asked them that, can you defund these guys, the Republic? And we were given a reply saying that Renault is severing its ties with Republic. So it was a nice little win. We were very excited about it. And then we started looking like in a collective group setting. We started also with the Stop Funding Hate there. We started pushing for advertisers on OP India, which is sort of like the bright part of India. And we started asking advertisers to back off from their advertisements because they were very anti-Muslims, very Islamophobic in their content. Plus, the situation which was boiling up in India following the CEA legislation there and anti-CEA riots, then the Delhi riots, and how OP India was rationalizing the violence against the minority communities was very heartbreaking in a lot of ways. And so we started questioning the advertisers on that, and almost 33 advertisers pulled out within the first 2 weeks. And with that report, we went to Google AdSense and we said that, how about you just defund them? And the question there was that there's this is a one-off example. And how do you go from a one-off example to claiming that a website is actually toxic? You can't just use one example. So in case of OP India, we used a lot of automation and data mining to basically understand where their sentiments lie. And we were able to show that their negative sentiment was much higher than the positive sentiment when they're talking about Muslims. So where do we go from there? So now we have started building up a consortium in that respect, and taking both the network campaigns and research forward in that direction to basically see how the hate is played online and what can be done about it.
Before we go into details, I kind of want to understand how, because you're not just organizations in UK now, this work is being done in UK, it's being done in India, it's being done in the US. Richard, perhaps we can start with you. Can you explain to us how Stop Funding Hate understands and maps the online economy of hate?
Yes, it was a really interesting journey for us, because when we started in 2016, we knew about the problems in the British press, and that was very much our focus. But just a few weeks after we launched our campaign, we noticed that actually lots of other people around the world were doing similar campaigns. And I think possibly the first one I was aware of was a group of people who just used the Stop Funding Hate hashtag and put DK on the end. So it was Stop Funding Hate DK, which was in Denmark. And from that we saw, oh, okay, so there's a problem of sort of new hateful websites in Denmark. And then around the same time, we saw this amazing campaign that was starting in the United States, Sleeping Giants, challenging Breitbart, particularly notorious extremist website. And what we started to realize was that the same factors that were making hate profitable in the UK were being played out in multiple different countries around the world. And actually the common factor in most of these countries was Google online advertising, particularly, and also social media. So we fairly quickly started to realize that this was actually a global issue, and therefore if we wanted to get to the bottom of it, it would really make sense to look to build alliances and solidarity with like-minded groups all around the world. And that was essentially what we started to do. There was always a sort of a balance, because early on, we'd set ourselves the task of taking on the Sun, the Daily Mail, and the Daily Express. So that includes the two biggest newspapers in the UK. So we always sort of felt, well, we've got quite a lot on our plate already. So initially we were quite careful not to sort of broaden our scope, but right from early on, we were really interested to see these other campaigns around the world, and we were always looking for ways to cooperate and develop a kind of common narrative.
Ritumbra, can you tell us about the case of India? In India, of course, you have platforms that you got deplatformed, but you also have mainstream, so-called respectable institutions that do something very similar, but in a more polished way. So how do you think about mapping the online economy of hate?
Yeah, so like in case of India, I think one of the biggest challenges going forward is going to be the political funding of the media, which is one of the massive sources of funding as well, and which is basically held by a very majoritarian sort of a political party at the moment. So anything that we are doing, it's going to have an impact or on the businesses, but at the same time, we have to also keep in mind that these businesses have to align with the current government, and the current government itself, from its own leadership, is also, speaking hateful content out in the open and using these media platforms to further their hateful agendas. So, and we are very aware of that, and so as of now, we have sort of like a credible network developing, which is looking at different media houses, not just the TV media, but also the newspapers and everything. And what we are trying to do at the back end of the campaign is also to basically analyze them and to at least document and make reports and documents around it to say that how toxic this content is. Because it's, after all, a democracy, right? So once the government hopefully goes out, then we can have a wider conversation around it at the political level. But we have definitely felt this, that also like with the corporations like Amul and the Parleji, who have said that let's defund the hate, let's be more kind in the advertising and be conscious about the advertising. But when we reach out to them and we say, do you want to join a conscious network, or you want to take this forward into a more coherent manner, then we don't really get much response from them, because they have to align with the political parties as well. So, and that is the real roadblock there in a lot of ways. So yeah.
Just as much as your campaigns have been well received and respected, there have also been pushbacks against the campaigns. A lot of critical press has also accompanied it. What I want to do is take a very critical look at the work you do, which is also looking at the strategies employed and what strategies have worked and what strategies haven't. Richard?
Yeah, so the single most effective tactic that we have seen in the entirety of our campaign is actually a tactic that we borrowed from Sleeping Giants, where if you see a hateful headline online on a website, and if you see an advert next to it, you take a screenshot, you publicly tweet that screenshot to the advertiser directly, and in a polite and friendly way, you challenge them about whether this is something that they really want to support. And using that tactic, the Sleeping Giants campaign managed to get over 4,000 advertisers to pull their ads from Breitbart. In the UK, we used similar tactics, challenging the Daily Mail. It got to the point where the Daily Mail actually turned off online advertising on all of their comment section at one point, their opinion section, because it had been putting them under so much pressure. So actually that one tactic is is extraordinarily effective for some really interesting reasons. And one of the sort of things that we're trying to do now is just share knowledge of some of these basic tactics as widely as possible, because our theory of change is that if enough organizations around the world know how to do this collectively, that alone would be a huge force pushing the media in a more responsible direction.
Ritumbra, what has worked within Indian context? Because the Indian context is also, as I said, a little bit more murky, right? Because it's not only tabloids that now spew hate. The so-called mainstream respectable media also does exactly the same. Can you talk us through that, please?
Yeah, so like in terms of India, like for Op India, the strategy which Richard just said, to take a screenshot and call the advertisers out, it did deliver quite some results, because the most of these advertisers were based out of India, and they did not had a fear of repercussion from their Indian customers or even the Indian government for that matter. But in case of the wider television media and even the newspaper media, it's really a wall there that needs to be fallen off. And I hope that with more campaigns coming forward and more people pushing that the hateful narrative should be defunded, and we should stop funding this hateful narrative, I think there would be a change. But for now, we also see a massive wall, a big troll army, actually, and also a counter narrative on, when you challenge an advertiser to defund something which is Islamophobic or anti-Dalit, then we also see a counter narrative building, which kind of says that if you support the Hindu nation, then you should support these support these channels, which is absolutely weird. And one of the key reasons for that is also because in India, we do not really have any laws around plurality or diversity or, hate speech as such, not even around, around diversity for that matter. We just have a plural country. So that's a challenge there. And I have personally thought that even like with this particular case of Sudarshan Television, which is a very highly Islamophobic content, even when we have taken screenshots and asked the advertisers to pull it off, the language has also played a barrier, because this is a Hindi content. It's not easy for the advertisers to understand, even if they're outside of India. They are not able to understand why this is problematic, because the translation might not be as problematic as it will be when spoken in Hindi. So yeah, these are some of the challenges, but we're going to learn through them and find a way forward, right? So
Ritumbra, I have a follow-up question for you. In India, you've seen other laws that have been put in place. For example, the recent purchase of BuzzFeed of Huffington Post now, because of the new FDI laws, means that Huffington Post India is now shut down. You also have a series of other laws that are increasingly either making it impossible for journalism, non-profit journalism to exist. How are you thinking through your strategies, given that I'm assuming UK doesn't have those kinds of limitations yet, but you are working under much larger limitations and restrictions. How are you thinking through and strategizing as India descends into more and more authoritarian repression?
Yes, so this has always been a question amongst all our discussions, that how far we are targeting the online based media, because we know that the funding limitations are already there, and a lot of these media houses are surviving on very limited resources, subscriptions mostly. And we are also pretty aware that the government of India is actually pretty eager to regulate online media. And that is not going to be in the space of free speech, but it is going to be like curtailment of this freedom of speech because the government wants to project a certain kind of a narrative. And this question also came because the OP India, for example, it has called itself as an intervening party to the ongoing litigation in the Supreme Court of India on hate speech. And we were very much eager to actually take to the Supreme Court and give them, show them, intervene as a party there and say on the basis of our results that, you know, the OP India needs to be taken off anyways because they are very toxic. But at the end of the day, we decided not to intervene as a party, but just send our results in and just lay them as evidence instead of being a party. And the reason for that was because we are really risking, we are really on a thin line there, because if any kind of legislation comes towards, or even a hint comes towards regulating the online media, then we know that a lot of Indian online media, which is perhaps like the last bastion of last soldiers of democracy in India, will come falling down. So it's a real challenge, to be honest.
Richard, you've written extensively on the idea of ethical advertising. But I'm kind of wondering now, is ethical advertising possible given how deeply neoliberal our structures are? For instance, today, Google and Facebook, that are not actually journalistic publishers, make far more money than an actual publisher. How do you think through these ideas of ethical publishing, given, again, the structures and limitations that you have to work with?
I think the starting point is let's look at where we are. Let's look at the power that we have, and actually, we do have power as consumers because the companies that we shop with do care what their customers think. And what we've also seen is, just in purely business terms, a big company that wants to attract customers from across society doesn't want to alienate an entire group within society, because that, apart from being ethically bad, it's also bad for their business. So it's more about, for us, it's about saying, well, let's look at the levers that are available to us. And what we've seen is that making this argument that advertising should have an ethical dimension has gained traction with advertisers. It does seem to make sense to people in the advertising industry. I suppose the other thing to say is all we're really doing is applying a way of thinking that already exists in other parts of business. So, you know, within the current system that we live in, for all its challenges and flaws, for example, we know that companies now, respectable companies, don't want to buy products from factories that use child labor or slave labor, and they know that they need to put due diligence checks in place proactively to make sure that they're not buying from suppliers who behave in that unethical way. And all we're saying is you should also apply the same principle to your advertising supply chain. And the reality is it seems to work, I think, partly because this is a way of thinking that companies already get. So because we've decided to just work with the system that we find it as we find it, you know, I completely see that there's an upside and a downside to that, but we've certainly found that it has been effective. And if it gives us another tool for challenging this problem, it's not going to solve everything, but we do think that it's a model that at least is working for the time being.
Richard, I have a follow-up. One of the main critiques that has been mounted against Stop Funding Hate is that it also goes against the principles of free speech. And it's quite surprising that that critique seems to have taken traction among certain groups. How do you address these concerns? Again, saying that the very principles that you leverage can become the principles that can be used against, can be appropriated and used by the right wing.
It's an interesting one because we don't hear that objection as much as we did at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And I think it's because when you actually look at the detail of that argument, it doesn't really make sense. So early on with Stop Funding Hate, the big one of the big successes we got was when Lego announced that they were pulling their advertising from the Daily Mail newspaper, and it actually became an international news story, and it was one of the things that got people talking about this whole idea. And if you follow the logic through, you know, Lego is a toy company. They make plastic toys and sell them for children to play with. They're a business, and one day they decided that they weren't going to advertise with this media outlet. They were going to spend their advertising money somewhere else, or put their advertising somewhere else. That was a business decision. They made it because they just decided that being aligned with this particular media outlet at this time is not right for us as a business. Nobody got locked up. Nobody got put in jail. Nobody got fined or even, you know, sued in a libel court. It was actually a very gentle way of responding to a problem, and it was all about consumer power. And again, I would say, you know, it's no more an abuse of human rights to say, I don't want my money to fund hateful media, than it is to say, I don't want to buy my coffee from a supplier that you know doesn't respect labor rights. It's actually, the argument we would make is that this is an expression of freedom of choice and freedom of speech. And exactly because it gives us a way to solve this problem of hate speech that doesn't require the government to do anything or the state to get involved, it's actually a safer way of dealing with it that avoids the risk of some of the unintended consequences that can come with badly drafted or badly thought through legal solutions.
Ritumbra, do you want to come in? Something very similar to India as well with the Republic TV, when Arnab Goswami, the editor, was arrested. Some of the arguments made by right wing was that his freedom of speech was being curtailed.
Yeah, so like first I just wanted to add to what Richard said, that I kind of agree with this whole methodology in a way, because at the end of the day, it's the choice of the businesses as well. Like, you can't tell them that they have to invest into such an ad areas and something. It's also their free choice, right? If they don't agree to what you are showing on the TV, they can also just take their advertisements away. It's for everyone. We can also, like what the Indian Supreme Court Justice said, that we can also just stop watching the television, right? So it's, at the end of the day, it's the free choice which matters, and having a dialogue in there, it's really necessary. And with the Arnab Goswami case, again, it's the same thing, right? Like the government, the case was not actually on a free speech, and somehow it got meddled up into this free speech zone. The case was actually on his abatement to suicide of another person who died a couple of years ago, and there were procedural lacunas there, which is not a topic for this conversation perhaps, but you know, the way how the rest of the media projected it to be a curtailment of freedom of speech, it was just very unfortunate, I would say, because that was not the essence of either his arrest or the case in which he's indicted. So,
both of you have had successes in terms of making advertisers leave, but the financial incentive of printing hate remains. How would you assess, with Richard, it's longer, you had about 4 years to assess what went right and what went wrong, and you guys are still trying to figure out the next steps. How would you assess your successes, but also how would you assess your failures? And I think it's also important for us to take account of the areas in which we have not done so well in order for us to move forward. Richard, would you like to go first?
Yeah, so actually, this campaign has been far more successful than we ever dared to hope, both in terms of the numbers of people that got involved, but also the way it's been received within the advertising industry, and fundamentally the impact that we've seen in the UK press particularly. So in 2016, there were over 100 anti-migrant front pages across the national papers. In 2019, we didn't see a single anti-migrant front page. And we also saw a significant reduction in the kind of overtly inflammatory, hateful headlines elsewhere in the press that we we've been seeing in 2016. So actually, I would say that for the time being, the campaign has helped to incentivize a significant reduction in hate in the UK context. Obviously, as you point out, that it's not like everything's fixed. And I think the real challenge going forward is how do we translate that initial success into long-term sustainable change? Because there are two elements to that. So one is that we've been successful, or our supporters have been successful in challenging the most extreme forms of hate, but we know there are still sort of more subtle narratives which are harder to tackle because they're a bit less obvious, but they can still be very harmful. So one of our less successful issues is how do you deal with the stuff that's toxic but harder to explain in a tweet. The other element is what we're hoping to work towards is a situation where, rather than waiting for people to complain to an advertiser to point out, oh look, you're funding this hateful content, we want to get to the point where companies proactively themselves put those due diligence checks in place so that they're not funding the hateful content in the first place, because that's what we think needs to happen in order to fundamentally change those market incentives. And ultimately where we want to get to is how can we ensure that actually responsible ethical journalism is positively rewarded. So how can we get to the point where advertisers are actually going out of their way to fund the good stuff, not only avoiding the bad stuff? And I wouldn't say, I actually think that's also been quite a successful discussion in terms of some of the developments that have happened within the advertising industry, but it's certainly still very much a work in progress.
Ritumbra, do you want to come in on this in terms of early learnings? I know this is still quite early stage.
Yeah, it is actually pretty early stage, and we're just starting to develop our networks also in India, having regular conversations with groups over there as well, and going forward. But I do kind of agree with Richard in this, that we have to look at the due diligence principles of the companies to ultimately break this cycle, because if the consumers have to go each time and point out to the companies that, you know, there's you're funding hateful media, it's usually too late by then. I would say. I mean, it's already out there in the public view, and then there's already this whole discussion about whether it was hateful or not, and it's already polarized the society about the content which is hateful or not hateful. So I definitely agree with that there has to be a more proactive steps to be taken by the platforms, by the companies, and this has to be in a part of their like business and business responsibilities and their own human rights responsibilities towards it. And like we were having a discussion with the Indian groups that in India, at least, we have the corporate social responsibility law, which talks about the social cohesion and the integrity of the nation, which could be utilized for it. But at the same time, this is also just a prescriptive law. It's not really something which can be, you can't go to the court of courts to say that the companies are violating it, right? So that kind of problems are there, but then we have to keep moving forward. We have to keep the ball rolling in some ways. So
as we come to the end of this conversation, I'm just going to put a question that came to us from an audience. This is from someone who is based in Texas. Here the question was asked. The question looks at, it's a very interesting question. It asks if the campaigns like Stop Funding Hate could also be directed against larger media platforms like CNN, NBC, and other major media news networks that sometimes amplify messages of President Trump, who sometimes often makes derogatory, xenophobic, anti-racist, anti-Muslim, anti-Jewish statements. Is that something campaigns like yours envision? I found this, I pulled this question because I found this very interesting, because now they're asking if you have envisioned these campaigns to go after large networks, while in the name of reporting news, actually help amplify information or news that is not correct. Would you either of you like to take that question?
Richard, would you? Fake news?
Yeah, to be honest, I think in principle, you can always make the argument if there is an example of hateful, problematic content on a media channel, anyone can make this argument. I think for it to actually work with advertisers, that there has to be evidence there that something contrary to journalistic ethics has happened. And I think maybe people would say it's actually quite a complex question. What are the journalistic ethics of how a mainstream media channel should report on the comments that have been made by a country's leader? And I would say that I wouldn't put that in the same category as calling African migrants cockroaches, which is like the sort of the most extreme example from the UK press with the columnist Katie Hopkins in 2015. I think that question of ethical reporting of problematic statements by politicians is much more complex, and I think it's an interesting question, but I would say it's a slightly different issue than the kind of hate speech that we've generally been focusing on.
Ritumbra, would you like to follow that up? Or?
Yeah, I kind of also agree with that, you know, where it comes to opinions, it's a bit more murkier when it comes to something which is actually hateful or can potentially incite violence or, you know, a more communal character in the real life. So there's definitely these thin lines there. But at the same time, I also see that a lot of the times these the opinions which kind of make the drip effect and can lead to something more hateful. But this is also an open conversation. We need to keep thinking forward, and we need to keep building structures into that. And obviously we now live in a space which is not just physical, it's digital space and it's online, and we perhaps need new set of laws and rules to play by the game. So yeah, it's an open space.
Quite interesting when I think it was CNBC and CNN that actually started cutting Trump's feed when he started lying about the elections. But Trump has lied about so many things in the last 4 years, which they never cut off. So again, interesting and murky spaces. As we come to the end of this conversation, how would both of you like to sum up your next future trajectories, the things that you're working on, and then what we should be expecting from both your remarkable organizations?
Well, thank you. I think I should give a mention to an amazing initiative called the Conscious Advertising Network, because I think this is one of the most exciting projects for helping to bring about this long-term systemic change that we're sort of dreaming of, because the Conscious Advertising Network actually has created a series of ethical codes that advertisers can sign up to, which give them the tools for doing that due diligence checking. And so, for example, if they sign up to the Conscious Advertising Network, they commit to doing everything they can to avoid advertising with media that fuel hatred, and also that fuel misinformation, actually. So it covers a wider range of issues. And globally, there are, I think it's in the region of $600 billion every year is spent on advertising. So if initiatives like the Conscious Advertising Network can make progress, and if enough big global advertisers sign up to CAN and other initiatives that push in the same direction, then you could get to that point where you get that systemic change. If even 10% of that $600 billion is redirected away from unethical media and towards the many media out there that are doing a responsible job, that in itself could really be transformative. And the other initiative I would mention is the Journalism Trust Initiative from Reporters Without Borders, which is another sort of part of the system where they're trying to come up with a kind of a codified definition of what ethical and responsible journalism looks like in a framework that could actually be audited. So if you're a responsible media outlet, you could go through the process with the Journalism Trust Initiative and get yourself certified as compliant with the highest standards of journalism. And that then provides a kind of signal for advertisers who want to fund the best, the gold standard. So what we're seeing is a number of initiatives are starting to come together, which collectively could really, really change that landscape. And this has all happened really quite quickly in the last couple of years. So I'm really optimistic that together with people-powered campaigns like Stop Funding Hate, like Foundation London Story, there's also this movement happening in the industry as well that I think we all need to support, that could bring about that bigger systemic change that really would solve the problem over the longer term.
Yeah. For us going forward, there are a couple of things which are happening. One of them is that we are trying to build an academic and public-private consortium to study hate speech in context of South Asia, because there is not enough contextual knowledge surrounding what constitutes hate and what doesn't in South Asia per se. So we are doing that. And at the same time, in terms of the campaign, we have got, can I also give a shout out to some of them?
Yes, please. Yes.
So we definitely have, we started with hate speech beta in the Radio Devanda and Defund the Hate, which has done tremendously well in the last couple of weeks, actually. And then there's Crude Darshan and also Toxic TV. So there's couple of networks which has now come up, and they are doing very phenomenal job. Couple of them are based inside India itself, and they are more on 24/7 loop of watching the television and picking up content from there and saying this is toxic, this is not toxic, which is very interesting to see. And I hope that together moving forward, we can make some changes, hopefully.
Richard, Ritumbra, thank you so much. You can learn more about the organizations Stop Funding Hate and the Foundation London Story. Thank you again for joining our podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.